This program was brought to you by AJ Longo and Associates.
Good evening, I'm Joe Carbonetta, and from the Pasadena Media Center, this is Arroyo Live. Our program is produced by Pasadena Media to help enrich our community through informative and meaningful conversation. Remember, you can share your comments with us anytime at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. A special note, this year, Pasadena Media is celebrating 38 years serving the community of Pasadena, providing municipal and public programming. A year after the unthinkable events which took place in our nation's capital following President Biden's 2020 election victory, it's hard to tell whether anything has changed. President Biden and the Democratic Party marked the occasion by directly blaming former President Trump for fomenting insurrection, then doing little to end the violence. The former president responded by denying any wrongdoing, while reaffirming his assertion that the election was rigged. Even though repeated investigations, both internally and conducted by third parties, have consistently proven the election results were and are legitimate. Equally disturbing, reports recently surfaced that a one-time campaign aide to the former president spent the weeks leading up to the anniversary posting messages across all the social media platforms calling for candlelight vigils in 20 major cities across the U.S. to honor those who stormed our nation's capital. Tonight, we take time to remember one of the most disturbing attacks ever to be perpetrated upon our democracy, the effects it had as events played out for the world to bear witness, and we'll talk about the current state of our politics and our country. Please join me for tonight's edition of Arroyo Live. Joining me are Hoyt Hillsman, chairman of the United Democratic Headquarters, and political consultant, Mr. Fred Register. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining me this evening. I'd like to start out by asking each of you to tell our viewers at home a little bit more about yourselves. Hoyt, if we could begin with you. You are the chairman of the United Democratic Headquarters.
Absolutely. Well, I've lived in Pasadena for 25 years and I've gotten involved in local affairs. I was always been a lifelong Democrat. My dad worked for President Kennedy, so it's in my blood. I got involved by running for office and also by being involved in our local Democratic clubs. I was president of the Foothill Democrats, which is an active grassroots organization of the party. And now I'm chairman of the steering committee of the United Democratic Headquarters, which is a coalition of Democratic clubs and grassroots organizations that work with the state party and the national party to elect Democrats in our local and statewide and national elections. So it's a great group. We have a lot of fun, actually, and we've become more active in recent years in between the election cycles. So if you go to PasadenaDemocrats.org, you'll find out about all the great things that we're doing. And I'll turn it over to Fred, who's been involved in this organization even longer than I have, and has a lot of experience in Democratic politics. So, Fred.
I'm a political consultant and have been for about 50 years, not quite that long. And I've also lived in Pasadena about 50 years, or around. I live in Altadena, actually. I've run campaigns for state legislators and for statewide elected officials for nonpartisan measures of various kinds, from school bonds to state initiatives. And for Democrats or for nonpartisan figures, I have worked for Republican candidates, but only when they were running in nonpartisan races. So I've done it for a long time, but mostly on the local and state level, not so much on the national level.
Well, again, thank you, gentlemen, both for being here with us this evening. We start out tonight's conversation, of course, reflecting on the events of a year ago, January 6th, the election certification in the wake of the Biden campaign victory. I'm curious to get each of you gentlemen's impressions of that particular day, the events that led up to the insurrection and the violence itself. And again, Hoyt, I'm going to go with you first, if that's all right.
Sure, absolutely. Well, of course, we were all shocked by what we saw on television and the subsequent events. I would say we were shocked, but not totally surprised, because the former president had been targeting this date of January 6th when the certification of the election was to take place in the Congress, and had called his followers out from around the country. I think I was somewhat surprised by the level of organization that we've subsequently seen from some of the extremist groups, the militias and otherwise. It may be that 90% of the people there were not part of some right-wing organization, but they got swept along, and at this point, 700 of them are being prosecuted for the crimes that day. I think in a larger sense, we talk about it as a threat to democracy. And when you get down to the systemic level, what you're really looking at is the process of certifying elections through the Congress and the Constitution. And that was under direct attack, clearly, because the former president was saying, don't certify this election, don't follow the Constitution. It's within our power to overthrow and to block a fair and free election.
And I think we all can remember the day. And in some ways, that's the most significant thing about it. We've been kind of a beacon of stability in the post-war world and long before that. So just the idea that a few thousand people could suddenly invade the Capitol and put the process of selecting the president at risk was shocking, I think, both at home and abroad. And for Americans, I think it was a lot of emotions, but for many people, I think it probably felt like this happens in other places, in small, unstable countries like Nicaragua or places. This is not something that happens in the United States. So it was a psychic shock in a lot of ways. And it'll be very interesting to see how it's remembered. In some ways, one of the remarkable things about the day is that there was so little violence. And I don't mean in the sense of, obviously, there was terrible physical violence. They stormed Capitol, people were hurt, a few people were killed. If this had been a serious coup, though, with all the weapons and the kind of the paramilitary organizations hovering about, you have to think there would have been some serious killing. And that didn't happen. So it suggests that at its heart, it was maybe not quite the kind of a coup that many of us perceived at the time, which doesn't in any way diminish its significance. It's a shock. And I think personally that in some ways, the worst outcome for the country is the one that happened. There are several other ways this could have ended. And I mean, for instance, if the vice president had surrendered to this pressure and done what the president asked, this question would have gone immediately to the Supreme Court. And the court, for all of its issues, has given no indication at all that any of its members have any patience for the Trump scenario. And I think all the indications I think we have in terms of what they did and did not do, that they would quickly have ruled that this was, that what Pence did at the president's request was illegal. And that we would have then, in some ways, that would have tested the system in a more clear-cut way. And then, of course, it could have devolved into real violence, and the Congress could maybe not have been able to come back. And then, in all likelihood, there would have been a military response and a really fierce backlash around the country. So, in some ways, the worst outcome for the country and the democracy is this sort of half world that we've entered, where the former president still gets to claim that his election was stolen, and that, the people who were there were there for a just reason, that there's been no official determination that puts his narrative. A truly remarkable thing is the degree to which he's been able to sell that narrative. And if with other outcomes, I think it would have been much harder for him to do.
Yeah, I agree with Fred there on especially the idea that the institutions held. I think that's an important thing for all of us to remember. But the other point, Fred, I agree with you too. It wasn't bad enough in a certain sense that people took umbrage or took a lesson from it. So there's a kind of enabling that continues. Oh, we can kind of get away with this. There were some bad people who were prosecuted, but
Right.
we can continue to pursue the big lie.
Right? It was bad enough in the moment. I
Yeah.
think in any normal time in our recent history, the reaction would have been fierce and bipartisan. And it started to be that way. But it's pretty clear that the members of the Republican Party very quickly began to hear from their own base, driven by the president. And he has, even without his former access to social media, he's been able to drive the narrative in a remarkable way, an ugly and dangerous way. But I don't think we can let those facts, blind us to the reality that he's been extremely effective. He's taken, Go ahead.
I would like to spend more time discussing the effects within the nation in a moment, but I did want to pose this question. This question to the both of you before we get into that. And that's on the international stage, there has been a lot of discussion about the breakdown of democracy that was witnessed around the world with the transpiring of those events on January 6th. But there is a flip side to that as well. A lot of people have said, well, this showed how ineffective democracy is, how easily it can be derailed. On the other side of that coin, however, we continue to function as a nation. We were able to move past those events. Things have, to some degree, normalized. And what hasn't happened is you don't see the very witch hunts that President Trump likes to refer to. The perpetrators of these events didn't suddenly disappear. There hasn't been mass political executions. None of the things that you see or hear about in other countries where there is no democratic rule of law. I would like to get each of your take on that.
Joe, it's interesting that you say that, because maybe a week after the 6th, I was on a call with a friend in India who's a very politically aware, active person. And his take on it was quite different from mine. It was very similar to yours. His view was, this is fundamentally a small thing that happened in a very stable country and everything held. And I wish we could be so sure that this would be the case in India or in countries that surround us. And that's a reasonable point of view. And I do think there are people around the world who see it that way. The reason I think that it's unsettling internationally is, I think, for two reasons. One is that it follows the Trump presidency, which I think shocked the world more than this insurrection. The idea that the presidency could fall into the hands of a narcissistic, clearly a person with a clear authoritarian bent, I think was a shock to much of the world. And then to have it followed by this insurrection in which the system held, but you could see very clearly how with just a twitch here and a break there and one or two people not doing their duties courageously, it could have broken. And that sense of fragility, I think, has real international and national implications.
I think the January 6th was the answer to that question, which is it means that there's a sizable minority of folks in the United States who have an anti-democratic view or authoritarian view of the political system. On the other hand, we see these all around the world, and we see those forces going on. And the lesson is that America actually has managed its way through this. It's funny, Winston Churchill used to say that America generally gets it right after they've gotten it wrong. And hopefully that'll be the future. The other thing I think is that Americans and people around the world had an unrealistic view of America as the beacon of democracy and freedom. And it isn't quite as bad as the Soviets said it was when they would press on about, or the Russians today, about our disregard for human rights, the extreme poverty in America, and all these things. It's not quite that bad, but it's not a utopia either, and it's not a democratic utopia. So we're going to be struggling in the same way that many European countries have with these elements. I think the final point is that we have a system based on a constitution that was written 250 years ago. And it was really written to limit government and make it as ineffective as possible on a federal level. And that's proven in the COVID and also in the elections to be a problem. And I don't know whether we're going to ever sort of reform our constitution, our system, so it'll work more effectively. But the appeal of the autocrats, Joe, as you were pointing out, is that they get things done, they get the trains running on time. It's much easier for them to solve problems by the wave of a hand, rather than having this clunky system that we have, which really prevents coordinated action on a national level.
Well, that's certainly true. I think also, though, that we've seen in some ways the strength of that original vision. It's scary to imagine Donald Trump for the last 4 years in a system that didn't have these real limitations on executive power.
I would like to say that I'm not so certain that the founding fathers created our form of government to make it ineffectual. I think it was more an attempt to keep it from becoming oppressive.
Yes.
And again, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Fred, but
I agree with you completely, and I think we in this country for a long, long time, we've taken it for granted that oppression and dictatorship and authoritarian rule are things that happen somewhere else. There were people who saw Roosevelt as a dictator and authoritarian, but in terms of something like what's happening in Hungary now, this is just something that we just never thought could happen here. And in a way, we've just seen that our system does work against that. And Donald Trump was a tsunami, and the dike held. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't continue to be and shouldn't be frustrations with the way our system does work against concerted action. But it's also an object lesson. And I sort of disagree with you, Hoyt. It's absolutely true that we, like every nation, tend to overvalue our own exceptionals, our own strengths, and think very highly of ourselves. But the reality of politics is that every system works fine until you hit a crisis. When you hit a moment where the countries are deeply divided over tough issues, then any system is going to crack. And ours is certainly showing cracks. But I don't know that it means that people's confidence in America as a stable democracy was overrated to begin with.
I don't disagree with your points. I was sort of thinking about what Joe had said about the appeal of authoritarianism. And when you have problems that seem to be intractable, difficult to solve, whether it's climate change, income inequality, or some of the other issues, the appeal of authoritarianism increases. Now, whether
Yeah.
or not it's a good idea, I fully agree with you that we've got a better system. But for some folks, a simple answer of somebody coming in and waving a wand, I alone can fix it, is the Trump motto, and that
Right.
does have appeal, and that is very dangerous.
Yes.
To trade in your system, which may be a little clunky and democratic, for one that is more efficient in the short term and authoritarian, is a devil's bargain.
Yes, and it's an interesting question. It's very frustrating now to watch Congress work or not work. And we get into the whole filibuster question and things like that. On the other hand, it's sort of striking to watch the Democratic Party try to govern and to succeed in a large extent with an extraordinarily small. I mean, it isn't a majority. I mean, it's tied in the Senate and 3 or 4 seats in the House, and yet on that very slender reed, the party is trying to push through a program that you could call as remarkable, as ambitious as anything since the New Deal.
Fred, as a political consultant, I would like to start out by asking your opinion on the Trump administration's response once the events began to unfold. Certainly, there's been a lot of argument, and justifiably so, that Trump and his administration were directly responsible for inciting the events which took place. Certainly, the speeches that he held in the moments leading up to the storming of the Capitol can very easily be argued were the impetus for the entire set of events that unfolded. But in the hours after the insurrection began, we heard nothing from the Trump administration. As a political consultant, what is your opinion on that?
We are learning now, I think, what we probably all suspected, which was that Trump loved this on one level. He saw his people out there doing what he had asked them to do, and he was trying to think. And as a result, he was never, at least initially, was not calculating the national interest at all. He was thinking about his own interest and how he could play it and how it would work for him. And you could see the rest of the administration, from what we seem to be learning now, everybody from Fox News, which is, I think, an unofficial part of the administration, to the military, to his family, to the key staff people, trying to reach him and to get him to do what any president should do, which is to try to stop this and to call in the appropriate force to make sure that it was stopped. And the fact that that did not happen, despite the concerted efforts of everybody in the administration except Trump, I think is the most telling. At the end of the day, when history judges Trump, I think it'll be harsh. I'm not sure what the verdict will be on whether he bears direct responsibility. I think he does, but the one thing I think no one will question is that his reaction was borderline treasonous and worthy of not only condemnation, but if it could be proven, and that will be the question, certainly worthy of conviction. Although that kind of step against a former president would have implications for our democracy and system that are not good to think about either.
Yeah, just to weigh in on that a little bit, I agree completely with Fred on the inaction and the treasonous nature of his actions. What's interesting to me, though, is in the aftermath in the months since, the strategy that he has followed and the Republican Party has followed is to change the narrative and to say that this really wasn't such a big deal, and who knows how history will judge it. It's interesting for me, though, to think about, as we approach the midterms, how well that strategy will continue to work. I understand, really, I don't agree with, but I understand why most Republicans support Trump and are unwilling to call out the big lie. I'm curious, and I'd be curious of what Fred thinks on this one, is after the Republican primaries, when they've either won or lost against, when the incumbent Republicans have either won or lost against the, let's say, an insurgent, a right-wing Republican running against an incumbent, whether or not that attitude, that strategy of hopping on the Trump bandwagon and going along with the big lie will continue, because they will be going into general elections. And in some districts where they have maybe under 5% margin in the last cycle, it may not be such a good idea to hang your hat on Trump, whether or not the Democrats make a big issue of it or not. But Fred, you would have a better sense of that. But I'm just curious about that strategy.
My sense is that this depends entirely on Donald Trump. And if Trump, right now, I think the way to bet is that Trump will run again and he will dominate the Republican primary process and be their nominee. That's not a certainty. There are many things that could derail it, including prosecution. But if that happens, I don't see anybody in the party pulling away from him before the general election. They will be all hands on deck because their base, the base that determines their futures, will be riled up to a fever pitch. The point at which I think the party could begin to regain it or change its approach and ideology will be if Trump is beaten in the primaries, and two, if he's beaten in the general election. I think if he's beaten in the general election as a two-time loser, he will begin to fade pretty quickly. And of course, he's an old man. I mean, not in great health. So he's going to be with us maybe actively another 5 or 6 years. And that's if he loses again, I think then his hold on the party will begin to shake. And the reason for that is there's no obvious successor. If Trump were to drop dead tomorrow, get hit by a bus or whatever, the party would be in total disarray because there is no, it's not that there's not a nominee. That would happen in the normal process. But as with all authoritarian figures, they clear out all the underbrush. There's one big tree in the forest, and that's Trump. And if he were gone, there's nobody else who could rally the party, his base, in the way that he has. So that would be a tremendous change. But I don't see it happening right now. I think I would bet against it. I think he goes in. I think he makes a second run. Now, the thing that could also change that is if he calculates that he would lose again. And I don't think he's not a man who wants to lose twice. And so one reason I think it's likely he's going to run now is that everything looks good for him. The President Biden is struggling. His numbers have. It's not that he's gained in Trump has gained in popularity, but he hasn't been dealt a death blow in the way that many thought he would be after January 6th. His hold on the party is as strong or stronger than ever. He's got a pathway to the nomination if he wants it. I think the only calculation for him will be the real fear that he might lose, because that would be the end of him.
Well, from a political standpoint, I would like to pose this question. Certainly from a political standpoint, there is clear reasoning for the Republican Party to continue to support Trump. But how damaging was it to our political system that the Republicans were willing to support Trump to the exclusion of seeing him held responsible for the events of January 6th?
Well, see, I would say a couple of things. And back to Fred's point from before, I was really thinking, Fred, about the 22 elections, because I think that after the Republican primaries, however those turn out, that may affect his brand. If, for example, the folks that he picks don't really succeed, or if they feel like the Trump brand, the Trump effect is not working so well, if they get some turned off independent voters or turned off Republican voters in swing districts, I see some fade away here, because I think that a lot of the Republican recalcitrance about blaming Trump is just a smart political calculation aimed at the primaries. And when you get to the general election, you're in a different environment. But to Joe, your question about how damaging it was, I think it's just one more step. I think that the election of Trump was damaging. I think that the way that the incompetency in his administration, I think the high-handedness, I think the Supreme Court nominations, I think a lot of these things were cuts to our, to the body of the body politic. So I don't see January 6th as necessarily being a big turning point. I think it's one more step, and it certainly wasn't enough to wake people up and turn them around, which is what I would be looking for some kind of watershed, either taking it in a good or a bad direction. But I see January 6th as kind of a continuation. Now, what January 6th did do for many of us on the Democrat side, and hopefully some Republicans, is it changed our worldview, that we thought, oh my God, this is really, it's going now to the level, it's a systemic level. It's not just one crazy authoritarian guy. And I think that's something that what Fred's point earlier about internationally, people are thinking, well, not only did they elect a crazy guy, but they let him threaten a free and fair election. So, it's drip, 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 I think.
I think you have to remember also that what we're seeing here is happening all around the world. We're talking about the dangers of authoritarianism, because authoritarianism is on the rise, especially in Europe. Russia has slipped into, after a very brief period where you might have called it democratic, or might not. It's clearly an authoritarian state. China, and it's just always been authoritarian, is even more so now within their own rules of succession. Eastern Europe has seen several authoritarian leaders rise, and even in the Western Europe, the opposition parties are moving, like as in France and other places, are moving to these same issues that Trump talks about. So I think in some ways, Trump was a shock to the system. Everything about him was a shock to the system. But what he's done, I think, when we look back on the sweep of things, I suspect what we'll see is that Trump effectively mobilized a coming realignment in the country. He pulled together a coalition. We keep talking about the Republican Party sort of regaining its senses, going back to what it was. It's never going back to what it was. That set of issues that Ronald Reagan and others ran about don't hold the party together anymore. If you were just doing a blind taste test and you put Reagan's policies next to Trump's policies, you would think they were radically different parties. And that Reagan republicanism is not coming back. We don't know exactly what's coming, but my guess is that some form of this Trumpian populism is going to define the Republican Party for quite a long time. And after Trump passes from the scene, I think what happens in our democracy is people identify with the party, and when they stop identifying with it, I'm trying to put this in the right way. When you poll people in America, we tend to think of the Republicans and the Democrats as fixed, though they're changing but the reality is the people who say they are Republicans varies from day to day and week to week and year to year. And right now, the people who identify, who are horrified by Trump and are angry at what he's done to their party are frankly no longer Republicans. They are mostly independents now, and some have moved toward the Democrats. And the people who are enthralled by Trump's view of the world, or his style, his pugnacity, many of them were not Republicans before, but they are now. So it's a different Republican Party, and it's going to continue to, by correlation, it's a different Democratic Party too, and that's going to continue to be true moving forward.
Well, turning back to the question for a moment of how damaging it was to our political structure that the Republicans were not only unwilling to charge Trump with anything, but actually went to great lengths to defend against him being charged. I'd like to pose a further question. How damaging was it for the Democrats, from the Democratic point of view? How damaging was it that trying to impeach Trump on the events of January 6th was the second attempt? Would it have been better for Nancy Pelosi to not have gone after him the first time? Would that have more likely resulted in more of the American public siding with the idea that Trump was directly responsible if that had been the first attempt at impeachment?
I think what's interesting about that, in all honesty, is how little consequence both impeachments were in the political alignment of the country. They were not inconsequential at all. Judged historically, both impeachments were not only justified, but might easily at different times have resulted in conviction and removal. But if either impeachment had not happened, or even both, I don't think we'd be in a fundamentally different situation now. The power of Trump as the pole around which our politics revolve now is such that anything the non-Trump side does is judged and rejected immediately by the Trump side, and frankly, vice versa. Trump did a few things occasionally, maybe by accident, that Democrats and others might applaud normally, but they couldn't. You cannot. It's very hard to get the words "Trump was right" out of your mouth if you are someone who hates him, and it's every bit as true on the other side. And so we've reached the interesting thing about our situation now. Trump is fascinating because he's condensed it and made it into something that is just unlike anything we've seen before. But the reality is, the big change is that we've moved, finally, the post-war consensus in this country is broken irretrievably. And we are struggling for a new dominant consensus. And in that process, we're very closely divided and along some pretty sharp and angry lines. It's not the first time it's happened in the country, but it certainly is more true now than any time in recent memory.
I think that's absolutely right. And in answer to your question, Joe, the implication of your question is, should we have not impeached him? And I'd say absolutely no, we should impeach him. And I think if there was a suggested strategy that by not impeaching him, you might garner some support, or you might develop some sympathy for your cause, I'd say that the President Biden's speech in the last week shows that it's better to go at this guy, both in a moral sense and also ultimately in a political sense. You got to call out these kind of things. This is just not something that you can, because you think you're going to lose, you're going to pass on it. On the other hand, it is not a strategy for electoral victory. It's not
right. Something
to say, we can't say, well, if we go out after Trump, everybody will start agreeing with us and vote Democrat. That is clearly not the case. Finally, to the point that Fred was making about the post-war coalition, politics is very dynamic, and they talked about the FDR coalition, but that was shifting all the time. there is no permanent coalition in American politics. And if you look at certain periods of time in the pre-Civil War era and the late 1890s, which led to the Progressive era, you had very similar civil disturbances. You had real polarization. And I would say that, the Civil War really couldn't be avoided with the way that the South had the narrative the South was following. Fortunately, in the Progressive era, where there was widespread civil disobedience, terrorism, assassinations of presidents, Teddy Roosevelt realized that the center was not going to hold, and he had the leadership to really turn his back on what was the reigning Republican view, and show some leadership, and really deflected what was going to be a terrible Civil War, again, a second Civil War. At least theoretically, civil disturbance and a breakdown similar to what we're seeing now. So, the question would be, we have this building a momentum that Fred talks about, the breakdown of the coalition, the polarization, the civil disturbance. And so how do you address that? And the only way, to address it is for a leader, some leadership that will offer hope to the people who are disaffected on both sides, and also the political will to fight the resistance to that, sort of the reactionary group. And I think that ultimately, and Fred may disagree, I don't think that's going to come up out of our system sort of organically. I think that we really do need some leadership there, and it may boil down to a single person who can pull a coalition together that turns the ship around. But that's a tough bet to make.
This brings us right into the current state of the political system, and the level of divisiveness that we are currently seeing is almost, at least on the surface, appears to be unprecedented. There really is no such thing as bipartisanship in our system of government anymore. How do we move forward? How is that affecting things now?
One of the things that's interesting, in some ways, this, in my mind, it's useful to link the question you asked about impeachment to this. We tend to judge our system, of what's normal in our system, by the most recent period of our own lives, which is normal. But the reality is, for instance, in impeachments, the Trump impeachments were the norm. The Nixon impeachment, where there was bipartisan turning on the president, is the abnormal thing. If you look back to the impeachment after the Civil War of President Johnson, that was an extremely partisan thing. The Clinton vote, the vote on Clinton, was as partisan as the Trump votes. Both Trump votes were the only impeachment in our history where the president's party has turned on him was the Nixon impeachment. And that took years. It didn't happen. It took like 18 months of just constant drip, 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 new revelations. So I think we make a mistake thinking that the Republicans' failure here is abnormal. That doesn't make it any more admirable. And it certainly highlights the courage of those few people who've done it. But the normal thing in this situation is, and it's one of the reasons impeachments have much less impact than people think they're going to have, and why they frankly are usually a foolish waste of political energy. After impeachments, the status quo tends to reassert itself. You saw Bill Clinton, zoom back to reelection. You saw the Republicans after Nixon go on a terrific run for almost 20 years. These things don't change the underlying dynamics at all. And as to how we deal with the division, in some ways, the aberration in our history is the period from about 1945 to 1985 or so, and after, where there was some it was kind of dealing with the Depression, the war, the Cold War, so it created kind of a consensus that yielded bipartisanship on a scale that I think, frankly, we've never seen it in this country. So sadly, we could simply be reverting to normal. That era was the result not just of the challenges the country faced, but the fact that we were going through an era of incredible prosperity and power at home and abroad. So the issues we were fighting about, looking back historically, were not very important. We were all united about our being the number one in the world and having a fabulous economy and so on, and defeating the forces from abroad. Now we're into a much more complicated world at home and abroad, and our politics are reflecting that, and that's sort of normal. So I don't mean to say that I think we'll be stuck with this deadlock forever. Usually the deadlocks break over some event or series of events. But I think the yearn for bipartisanship, which I very much share, by the way, I think it was aberrational at the time, and I think we are unlikely to see it again.
Yeah, let me follow Joe just a second on that, because the issue of divisiveness is a very interesting one, which I've thought about a lot. And just to interject a note of optimism here, I completely agree with Fred that the normal state of American politics is clash, conflict, divisiveness. I'm thinking about people bemoan the culture wars, and to a certain extent, they're difficult and they cause rifts in families and things like that. But then when I think about the way that democracies can operate, the culture clash, and politics follows culture. I think that the culture clash, if you look at it today, the issues that we are wrestling with as a nation are very important and fundamental. Let me just give you a couple of them. The idea of when does life begin? That's a huge moral and political and societal issue. It's a cultural issue. And we're arguing about that in the abortion debates. We're also arguing about who is a citizen. And we have many, many different ideas about who should be a citizen. What is the concept of self-defense? How much are you entitled to defend your home, and with what kind of weaponry? These are huge issues. And eventually my hope is that through the clash, these culture wars, that we'll come to some kind of consensus. This is kind of what we've always done, some kind of consensus. People fought about whether women should have the right to vote. Now we don't think about it. People fought about whether alcohol should be prohibited. These are big issues, and ultimately, after a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, hopefully not too much blood, we as a democratic society came to some cultural agreement about some of these important issues. So that's my little note of optimism tonight.
Well, Fred, I want to go back to something you said in your response just a few minutes ago. You mentioned the aberration, I believe you called it, of political stability that lasted for a number of years, but again, that is not the normal. However, that aberration coincided with a long period of prosperity, a growing and thriving middle class.
Right.
In very recent times, we're seeing the middle class literally going away, and of course, history is littered with societies where, when the middle class disappears, political instability ensues, which ultimately has resulted in the destruction of whole cultures. How do we tie all that together? And is there a correlation?
Oh, there absolutely is. And it's one of the reasons we had that aberration is that we were the sole economy standing after World War II. And for decades, we coasted on that, and we had a prosperity relative to the rest of the world that was unsustainable. And now we are back to dealing with the kinds of issues that every country faces. It doesn't mean that we aren't exceptional in many ways, but this failure of the middle class is not an American phenomenon. It's the reason that politics are being riled throughout Europe and in other parts of the world, but especially in the West. And how we deal with it is not yet clear. I mean, the traditional answers from the left especially, but actually a part of a broad consensus, was that education would and equal opportunity would gradually address this issue, and that the middle class would grow as people achieved higher levels of education. It's not entirely clear that that's true anymore. And it's also true that the education itself is getting more and more unequal. And so one of the real drivers of the Trump phenomena is this instability in the middle class. And one of the real dangers of the Democratic Party is that our historic connection to the working class part of the middle class. The middle class is millions and millions of people doing many different kinds of things, but the party's connection to the working class part of the middle class is getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And that whole segment of the electorate is moving toward the Republicans, has moved very strongly among white voters, regardless of income, and is starting to move even among ethnic voters, African American and especially Latino and Asian too, that people who are middle class and uncertain about their prospects and their future, and who are not riding the incredible wave of prosperity that this modern economy is producing for so many people. That's still the majority of the country. And it was traditionally the root of the Democratic Party, and it is not anymore. And to the degree that the party continues to slide away from that focus and to allow the Republicans to increase their hold on it, that's the only reason the Republican Party is viable nowadays, is that Trump, especially him, has succeeded in pulling a whole cadre of people that once were natural Democrats into the Republican orbit, and they're not coming back. So the question is, I think, can we successfully fight for those working class, middle class folks who are stressed? Can we provide a vision for their future and our common prosperity that prevents them from falling into the kind of cynicism and hostility toward competing ethnic groups that the Trump folks are selling? I think that's the big question for the Democrats.
And Hoyt, I'd really like to get your response on this too. We only have a few minutes left in the program, but I would really like to know your thoughts on this also.
You're saying to me?
Yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is the conundrum. I would add one other element though, which is the generational element, and that's where I see a lot of hope, because Fred talked about the breakdown of the narrative, the post-war narrative, and our worldview. And in my experience, the younger generation, and now I'm talking about under 30s, have a different worldview than we do. They seem to be the normal divisions, what we used to consider normal divisions between black and white, and straight and gay, and some of the other shibboleths that were around in our society have changed. And the other point, which is probably more important, is that they're post 9/11 kids. They're living in a much different world than what we grew up in. And the Pax Americana that Fred described, where we had prosperity, peace, no polarization, not as much polarization, is not their experience. They're experienced in a world of that's divided, that's polarized, that's stressed, that's threatened, that's violent, and they will find new solutions to those vexing problems politically that we don't necessarily see. So it's sort of hard for us to predict what's going to happen. Unfortunately, I mean, the Democrats have always been counting on younger voters to bring a more progressive, leverage into our government. Unfortunately, they haven't stepped up to the plate as much as we Democrats had hoped in terms of voting. I begin to see this in some elections where the younger people are voting. But they, interestingly enough, we've always been based on a two-party system and the loyalty to your tribe. They are sort of much less interested in parties than in issues. So they really divide by the climate activists or the racial activists or others, and are not so committed because they see all the problems with the Democratic Party system, the Democrat and Republican parties. So that's where I put my hope. And I don't know what that coalition looks like. And a lot of young people are going to be conservative. That's not a given. And certainly the ethnicities, that's not a given. So those are my observations.
Well, what you bring up an interesting point in these waning seconds of the program. Do both of you gentlemen, either of you gentlemen, think that we might be looking at a future where we're not simply a two-party political system anymore?
Mm-hmm.
I don't. The structures are such. We handle the divisions that other democracies handle with multiple parties within our two parties. In primaries, in occasional third-party candidacies. And it may or may not be the best system, but the way our system is set out, it's very hard to break that. And I don't see that coming. What I do see is, big contests within each party to become the dominant faction in that party and therefore in the nation.
It is. I agree with that, Fred. But I also think that there is precedent for parties disappearing. The Republican Party, the Whig Party disappeared in the pre-Civil War era. So I'm not sure that can happen now. For one reason,
but that's not a real happy precedent. That's the prelude to the Civil War.
No, I understand. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just saying that and I think that today. Money is the bottom line. The famous saying from the Texas congressman is there's three important things in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember the other two. And I think that's true of our political system right now too.
Well, with that, I'm afraid we have run out of time. Mr. Hoyt Hillsman, Mr. Fred Register, thank you, gentlemen, both for joining me this evening. It has been a fantastic discussion. I could stay here and talk with you both for hours. But I'm afraid that would probably anger a producer somewhere. Hopefully we can have you back on the show again sometime soon. I would certainly love to continue this discussion.
I'd love to do it.
Thank you, Joe.
For our viewers at home, if there are topics you would like to see addressed on this program, you can email them to arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org, and we may include them in a future broadcast. Until next time, this has been Arroyo Live. I'm Joe Carbonetta. Thank you for watching, and good night.
This program was brought to you by AJ Longo and Associates.